Brent Edwards, Radio New Zealand's former political editor and now news director. You became political editor in 2006, the same year John Key became leader. You watched him become PM in 2008, get re-elected in 11 and 14. Obviously you're surprised, right?
Yes, I expected, he'd made it clear, I think Peter Dunn talked about how John Key did talk about Keith Holyoake. He was very aware of political history, particularly the history of the National Party, and I think he was very aware of the legacy of Holyoake having served 4 terms, although Keith Holyoake stepped down a year before the end of that 4th term. So there was always an expectation that John Key would continue, although again, as he said, he's never been the career politician. He didn't come into Parliament in his 20s or even in his early 30s. So I guess it's not been something that he's seen that he would stay in all his life. So he's presumably made the decision that it is, as you said, a brutal job, very tough, and presumably he's looked ahead. He can't perhaps face the prospect of another election campaign. They are particularly brutal, and then think of going into a 4th term because of the time and the energy it would take. And at times while I was there, he did look terribly tired and exhausted, and obviously it's a big impact on family.
Can we talk about who was likely to replace him? Can we do a short list? So Bill English is obviously... Bill English had a terrible time in 2002. Right, yeah. Okay. But you think his skin is thick enough, and I'm not meaning that in a pejorative term, for him to come back and have another crack at it?
Well, Bill English is a career politician, really. Bill English has been there for many years, elected at first in 1990.
That's right.
And obviously very committed to the job. He's stayed on. He's been finance minister all the way through and as deputy to John Key. So clearly, and he's been anointed by Mr. Key, which is interesting. That's given him a very strong push to get the job. It would be extraordinary actually to think then, if you're anointed by John Key, given how successful and popular John Key has been, the caucus would perhaps vote for someone else. But there are other contenders.
Let's name some names. Judith Collins?
Well, I think Judith Collins may well think she's a contender.
And that's the point, isn't it? At this stage, surely she is sitting there thinking, yep, I'm going to give this a crack, right? So somebody is going to have to dissuade her from that, or am I being unfair to her?
Well, she may well think she's a contender, but she hasn't done herself many favours with that caucus over the past few years. At one point, she clearly was seen as perhaps the favourite at some point to replace Mr. Key, but she's gone well down the pecking order. Paula Bennett is another one who's been promoted and given opportunities and seen as a possible leader contender.
She's had a tough few months, hasn't she, with housing?
Yep, she's had a tough few months with housing, as has Bill English really, and John Key. As David Seymour was saying, the government as a whole has had a tough number of months with housing. The interesting thing will be what it means actually, and again Peter Dunn made comment about this for next year. Going into an election year, it changes the whole dimension of election year.
Now Andrew Little is on the phone and he's going to be listening to this. Is this a gift to him?
Well, John Key has been an incredibly tough opponent for every Labour leader so far. So I would imagine that Labour would be looking at this and thinking it's a good thing for them. But whoever comes in is not going to presumably have the level of popularity that John Key has had for so long. And as we saw from the poll of polls this morning that Jane Patterson talked about, National still with a very, very substantial lead in those, all of the polls that have been going on through this year. So Labour may well see this as another opportunity to try and narrow that gap.
Thanks, Brent Edwards.